Hello again. This is Jerry. This is the One New Man Ministries podcast. Glad to have you on board. One New Man Ministries is an Ephesians 2 ministry dedicated to reconciling the people of God, with one another, reconciling God to the world. God is in the business of bringing parties together, and that's what we're trying to do here in One New Man Ministries. We are based on these verses in Ephesians chapter 2, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross. So that's who we are. And today I'm happy to be talking with Jen Rosner. Jen, this is our second conversation. I'm so glad to have you back. It was so interesting and enlightening the last time. I'm looking forward to this. Please tell our audience who you are and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's an honor to be back. I look forward to having another conversation. So I can tell you like a little brief bio of myself. I was born and raised in a Jewish home, kind of had a nominal Jewish identity. We weren't particularly connected to any Jewish communities growing up. I went off to college at a large public state school in California, and it just so happened that all of my friends were Christians. So I heard the gospel for the first time. And I was a political science major in college, planning to go on to law school, but I had this whole sort of sub-narrative going on where I was just sort of fascinated by learning more about Judaism on one hand, which I had not, I didn't have a very deep knowledge of growing up, but also learning more about Christianity, and started attending a Christian church because my roommate did, started attending Campus Crusade, which is now called Cru. And it became kind of a spiritual odyssey for me in some sense. And my last year in college, through a particular set of circumstances, I ended up becoming a believer in Jesus, and was just so fascinated that I ended up sort of scrapping my plans to go to law school and instead going on to divinity school. So I did an MDiv at Yale Divinity School, where I felt like just a kid in a candy shop taking classes on biblical languages and church history and systematic theology, and just really sort of loved all of it. And it was then my last year at Yale that through a friendship with my cousin, who was undergoing Orthodox conversion to Judaism, that I really started to realize that by just kind of going wholesale into the Christian world, which is what I did after having become a follower of Jesus, I didn't know how to reconcile my own Jewish identity and my faith in Messiah. And it was really through very in-depth conversations with my cousin that I realized that I had sort of left something important behind in not allowing my Judaism to inform my discipleship to Jesus. So I went on then to do my PhD at Fuller Seminary back in California. And my own wrestling with Judaism and Christianity really kind of, I found a structured way to address some of those questions and tensions in my dissertation, which ended up getting published as my first book, called Healing the Schism, where I look at Karl Barth on the Christian side and Franz Rosenzweig on the Jewish side as these kind of 20th century pioneers of a new era that I think we're very much living within now, of Jews and Christians kind of rethinking the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in some very significant and fruitful ways. I finished my PhD and met my husband, who was a Messianic Jew from Virginia, who had made Aliyah to Israel. We got married a year later and ended up, I joined him in Israel. We spent the first 2 years of our marriage in Israel and have since been back in California. We have 2 children. I teach kind of in a part-time capacity for a number of schools online, and have also been writing. So my most recent book, which was released in 2022, was called Finding Messiah, A Journey into the Jewishness of the Gospel, which really sought to, it's not an academic book. It sought to sort of bring onto the radar screen of just normal Christians in pews the Jewishness of Jesus, the Jewishness of the New Testament, God's ongoing covenant with the Jewish people, And I'm currently working on an academic book that is in many ways a follow-up to Finding Messiah, generated by a lot of questions from early readers of Finding Messiah that looks at Gentile identity in the body of Messiah. So if we believe that there is still Jews and Gentiles in the body of Messiah, the Messianic Jewish movement, which I consider myself to be a part of, has done a lot of thinking about what does it look like to forge authentic Jewish pathways of discipleship to Jesus. And that leaves open this sort of whole question of Gentiles and what does it look like for Gentiles to follow Jesus? And you have all kinds of interesting and not always so healthy and positive, from my perspective, tensions between Gentiles who think it might be just like a little bit better if they were Jewish, or they seek to follow the Jewish calendar or worship Jesus in Jewish ways because it feels more authentic to them. And so I'm sort of trying to address those issues in my most recent book that I'm still currently working on, and in some sense sort of raise the theological profile of Gentile identity. I don't think it's a mistake that God created many nations. And so that's a little bit about me and about my work.
Well, I had a whole set of questions that I sent you in advance, but just listening to your rundown right now, I don't know if I should follow up on some of those. The whole question of Gentile expression as a grafted in group of people is a wild thicket. It seems to me, all the way from I need to be entirely Jewish and wear tzitzit and talits and all of the paraphernalia, to adopting the calendar, just rejecting everything. There's a pretty broad spectrum, and I agree with you that there's a reason God made nations, and He made Israel and the nations for Israel to bring the nations to worship the one true God, but He didn't ask the nations to become Israel. Right?
Yep.
So what does that look like under the new covenant? I'm looking forward to your book.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying over and over again, I don't presume that I can solve all of the problems and answer all the questions, but I hope to at least generate perhaps some new conversations around this issue.
Well, that is a really important topic. It'll be interesting to see, I guess. We've spent, let's say, from the Council of Nicaea till now, that amount of time where the Gentile church is dominant and has led the way in how to disciple people. And then we certainly have a whole new strain of things developing from the Reformation forward, and then from Azusa Street forward. A lot of different discipleship strands. I'll be interested to see how you think we ought to be discipling Gentiles these days.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I it's a huge topic, so I hope to just sort of broach it a little bit in this new book.
Okay. Well, I did have a couple things from our last conversation and thinking about things since then that I wanted to address with you, and maybe this is a good question to ask following on to your book topic, and that is I have been thinking about some different proposals about who is or are the people of God. Is there one people of God? That was a very strong position of my Reformed theology teachers in seminary, one people of God. Is there two people of God? Two people of God? Are there three peoples of God? I've seen proposals all the way from 1 to 3. So maybe you could lead us out of the woods on that one a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to say some things, and then I'm curious how there would be three people of God. That's an interesting construal that I'm not sure that I could map out. You could maybe help with that. I mean, I think from my perspective, any conversation about the people of God always has to start with the people of Israel, right? The biblical narrative attests that the people of Israel are the people of God. I think we get that from Genesis 12 all the way up through, I would argue, through the book of Revelation. I think God's election of the people of Israel has to be the sort of ground zero of conversations about these things. And I think we have a construct in the Old Testament and the Tanakh whereby you kind of have Israel as God's chosen people, juxtaposed over against the nations, who in most instances are warring against Israel, dragging Israel into idolatry. I mean, you have some really notable and significant exceptions to that, right? Instances where God uses people from the nations to work for his purposes. But I would say that that's not the norm throughout the biblical narrative. And so I would say then one of the most remarkable aspects of the coming of Jesus is this sort of opening of the covenant to Gentiles, what we call Gentile inclusion, which I think we do get kind of murmurings and foreshadowing of throughout the Gospels, but I think we mostly see coming to fruition in the book of Acts. And it becomes a clear focus in Paul's letters, Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. And so it's interesting because when I think about these things, I think very much about the verses in Ephesians 2 that you read at the beginning of our time together, because I think, as it says in Ephesians 2, that those who were once separate from Christ, excluded, this is actually probably right before the part
Right
that you
before,
read, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. I think that's a description of the nations prior to Christ. I mean, again, you have exceptions to that, and you have this interesting category of God-fearers who sort of joined themselves to the people of Israel, but that was all minuscule in terms of the global population, which was largely composed of the nations, who were, I would say, all of these things that are described in Ephesians.
Sure.
Separate from Messiah, excluded from citizenship in Israel, foreigners to the covenant, without hope and without God in the world. And so from my perspective, what you have in Messiah is, again, this sort of opening of the covenant to the nations, who all, and we see this in very powerful ways in the book of Acts, most prominently displayed by the coming of the Spirit, right? The Spirit comes on the Jewish people in Acts 2. And then in Acts 10, we see the Spirit coming on Gentiles in the same way that the Spirit came on Gentiles in Acts 2. So it's very clear that there's something new happening, and that becomes kind of this foundational moment. We see it talked about very clearly in Acts 15. And so you get this notion of distinction, right? So Acts 15 then says, okay, well, so all of these Gentiles are coming to Israel's God. And you have Pharisaic believers in Jesus who are saying, well, then clearly they have to be Jews. Like, that's the way it always worked. You want to follow the God of Israel, you become part of the people of Israel in this certain ritualistic ways in which that always had happened. And what the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 decides is like, no. And the evidence that's given for that is that the Spirit came on Gentiles as Gentiles. They did not have to become followers. They did not have to become Jewish in a sense. And so I would say that, if coming back to your question about the people of God, we start always with God's covenant with the people of Israel. And then, to use Paul's language in Romans 11, you have Gentile nations grafted into that through the work of Messiah, through this Gentile inclusion, this opening of the covenant that we read about in our New Testaments. So I would say one people of God, that's really significant, starting with Israel, and then the nations sort of joining into that peoplehood through Messiah. And I think it's interesting because you mentioned Reform circles. I remember once when I was in college, I had a very good friend who was a Presbyterian pastor, and he was doing a series on election. And I was so excited to hear his take on election, and never once in an entire sermon series on election did he mention the election of Israel, right? And so I think that that's sort of evidence he talked about all these sort of Calvinist Reformed views on election, which is fine, but I think it's a non-starter if we are going to talk about election or peoplehood and not automatically begin with Israel.
Okay. So let me understand what you're saying. So at this time, you are saying there is one people of God, and that's Israel, with the Gentiles being grafted in.
That's my understanding.
Okay. All right. So what I've seen is you have Israel, the one people of God formulation that you get in Reformed circles, one people, one grace covenant, and everybody, the people of God, are in there. So then a second formulation would be, as things stand right now, the people of God are the elect nation of Israel. That election doesn't change, but you have the church,
Mhm.
which would be all the people who've put their faith in Messiah, Jew and Gentile alike. And I guess a third formulation that I've seen has
Mhm.
been, and maybe they don't mean it so much as a third people as much as it's kind of like a Venn diagram.
Mhm. Mhm.
Judaism and the church with Messianic Jews in the middle.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, so that would be the three. It sounds like
Right.
you're saying. Yeah, I mean, again, I get the Venn diagram. I just think the witness of the New Testament is about oneness, as in your own ministry and the emphases thereof.
Mhm.
And so I do think that Messianic Jews or Jewish followers of Jesus, both in the first century and in our day, do play an important role as kind of bridge builders. There's a term that I love from, I think it's maybe from Christian missiology, called cultural brokers, like people who can kind of go between one culture and the other and sort of translate certain key things to people
Mhm.
who are not directly related to one another. So I do think there's an important role that Jewish followers of Jesus have, both sort of theologically and quite practically. But from my perspective, again, it's still the one people of God, grounded in Israel's election, Gentiles grafted in. And so you do have, like, if you have a Venn diagram, like Jewish followers of Jesus serving a significant role in that regard. But from my perspective, it's still always one people of God. I think it's problematic, and I think it will ultimately lead us into troubling territory if we ascribe multiple peoples of God, from my perspective.
Okay, so the election of Israel as the people of God
Mm-hmm.
does not preclude that within Israel some people will never truly be in relation with God, right?
I mean, that's an interesting question, right? Because it's a rather recent modern phenomenon of sort of secular Judaism, right? But I think if we're talking about the Jewish people, anytime historically up until the modern era, the last few hundred years, the Jewish people are those who are in covenant relationship with God. And especially given what I consider to be very troubling schism between Judaism and Christianity, this sort of pervasive pattern of Christian supersessionism, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism. I am very hesitant to say that. Obviously, I think that followers of Jesus have an awareness and a knowledge of the full revelation of God in a
I
very
guess that's what I
significant
was really
way.
alluding to when I said not in relation, but they haven't come all the way to faith in Messiah.
Yeah. I still think, and there's some really interesting like literature out there that sort of talks about this, but I still think that I would say this is how I would frame it. I would say that yes, Jews are missing something by not knowing Jesus, their Messiah. But I would say in like the same breath and with just as much emphasis, Gentile Christians are also missing something to the extent that they understand Jesus in the New Testament in categories such as election and peoplehood apart from the people of Israel, which is
Right.
exactly what historically the Christian church and Christian theology has done. So I think it's kind of a double blindness in which for me emphasizes the fact that both need each other. I don't see that as like a one way, like the Jewish people are sort of these subjects of like just sort of all the other people groups who Christians need to share the gospel with. I think Christians have something very unique to learn about their own Messiah from the Jewish people, and certainly Jews who don't know Jesus, but who live according to this historical ancestral covenant between the Jewish people and God. So I see that as going both ways, whereas I think more often it's the notion that sort of Christians are enlightened and Christians have to bring the gospel to everybody, including the Jewish people. I see it as much more two-way blindness and in need of the
Mhm.
other. Jews need to know about Jesus, and Christians need to know about the Jewishness of Jesus and God's covenant with Israel and how that's the only way that we can actually properly understand Jesus.
Right. Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Kind of along the same lines that we've been talking about, a Messianic rabbi that I know talks about the necessity of Jews and Gentiles working together in their distinctive callings,
Mm-hmm.
complementarianism,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
used in a different context, but that's that's really in order to show the full glory of God. We need both the Jewish expression of worship and the Gentiles brought into the worship of the one true God, but as different people, right? With the unique ways that God's created them to be.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. And I would say that Mark Kinzer, who's a Messianic Jewish theologian, he wrote a book in 2005 called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism, and he coined the term bilateral ecclesiology, ecclesia being sort of the people of God, the followers of Messiah, actually more specifically followers of Messiah. And it's bilateral in his rendering. There's Jews and there's Gentiles within Messiah together. And he has very much in his own work spent a lot of time and spilled a lot of ink trying to spell out what that looks like, particularly for Jewish followers of Messiah. And so in my work, I'm trying to fill out the other, or at least, as I said, take a few steps in filling out the other half of that equation, which is Gentile followers of Jesus. So I would agree with that.
Yeah. Somehow it's all going to work out.
That's right. That's right.
We are headed for a great end times revival, and the fullness of the Gentiles is going to come in, and all Israel will be saved, despite our worst efforts.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. That's
well,
right.
Maybe this is the place to bring up that other thing that we talked about briefly. This being the 60th anniversary of Nostra. I never say it right.
Aetate, I've heard.
My Latin is really poor. And also the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea. And you said that you had, tell our audience, first of all, what's Nostra Aetate? And I have to tell you, it has just exploded. The things that I'm reading, it's all of a sudden everywhere. So why is that? What is it, and what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time talking about, apparently 2025 is this very significant year in church history in both of these regards. So maybe we can talk a little bit about them in turn. Nostra Aetate is a document that is issued by the Catholic Church towards the very end of the Second Vatican Council, which takes place from 1962 to 1965. The Second Vatican Council is addressing a lot of things. It's one of these sort of big Catholic councils that happen every so often throughout the history of the Catholic Church. And of course, it's taking place in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, where the Catholic Church did not fare particularly well. The Catholic Church entered into an accord with Hitler during the Holocaust, which I think brought to the surface anti-Jewish teaching that had been deeply rooted in Catholic teaching for centuries. So I think in many ways, the Holocaust sort of brought to the surface Christian anti-Judaism more broadly. I would say it's equally present in the Protestant church, but specifically within the Catholic Church. And so you have, again, the Second Vatican Council that was addressing lots of things, but one of them was the Catholic Church's relationship to the Jewish people. And so you have the issuing of this document called Nostra Aetate, which means in our day or in our time. And what's interesting is that as the document stands, there's sort of one big paragraph that talks about the Catholic Church's relationship to the Jewish people. As I've heard it told, originally the intention was that the entire document would have focused only on the Catholic Church's relationship to the Jewish people. And then you have like Catholic bishops in the Middle East who are saying, well, if we're saying something about Judaism, we should probably say something about Islam. And so the document gets a bit broader scope than it was originally intended to have. And it's interesting because to this day, the main topic of conversation regarding Nostra Aetate is the Catholic Church's relationship to the Jewish people. There are these other aspects of the document that have not gotten nearly as much sort of press time, which I think is illustrative of maybe the fact that the document was originally intended just to be about the Jewish people, and then it ended up sort of having these other things that nobody has paid quite as much attention to. And so the document is really sort of working to renounce a lot of, again, sort of embedded, latent anti-Jewish Catholic teaching, kind of affirming in specific ways the ongoing election of the people of Israel,
Right.
It's charting out a new way for a Christian theology of Israel, a Christian relationship to the Jewish people, and it's not just that you have Nostra Aetate and then nothing else. It actually really sort of kicks off a series of reflection among Christians worldwide and non-Catholic Christians as well. And so in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council and the publication of Nostra Aetate, you get lots of Protestant denominations that then create official statements about the church's relationship to the Jewish people. And so I think, and this is, this is sort of the subject of my first book, Healing the Schism. We are living in an era, sort of latter half of the 20th century and now going into the 21st century, where it's just remarkable. You could look across the spectrum. I mean, we can even look at biblical studies, for example. The whole... One of the main touchstones in sort of Pauline scholarship or gospel scholarship is thinking about the Jewishness of Jesus and rethinking these Christian categories that, again, had been done in remove over against the Jewish people, right? So there's this kind of, I think Nostra Aetate really takes a very significant step in rethinking those and in sort of beginning to sort of turn the tide that lots of other Christian denominations then follow suit. So in some ways, I think we could say there's lots of significant 20th century events that sort of caused Christians to think in a new way about the Jewish people and the relationship between Christians and Jews. But I would say if we had to sort of point to a document, Nostra Aetate maybe sort of kicked off this season of Christian reevaluation of God's covenant with the people of Israel that has, again, now become very prevalent in our day in a remarkable way. But maybe you could say, in some sense, all began with the publication of Nostra Aetate. So,
would you say that that document worked in the other direction also, because there is a much greater Jewish openness to Jesus than there used to be? Also, do you think it had a
absolutely.
hand in that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you have, I mean, really, since Vatican II, you have this widespread, as we've been talking about, sort of Christian reassessment of God's covenant with the people of Israel. And then you begin to have Jews who take note of that and who say, gosh, if Christians are rethinking their theology of Judaism and the Jewish people, we really need to rethink our theology of Christians, because Judaism had by and large developed, and I think for understandable reasons, a very defensive, kind of almost antagonistic posture towards Christians in response to centuries of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and supersessionism. So one interesting book in this regard is this book called Christianity in Jewish Terms, which was published in 2002. And it's by a group of Jewish scholars who are wanting to sort of say, okay, we need to respond to things like Nostra Aetate, to this new era of Christians rethinking God's covenant with Israel. And along with this book was published a statement called Debru Emet, which in Hebrew means speak the truth. And Debru Emet, I can just look it up here because I do think it's sort of relevant for the conversation that we're having. Debru Emet really charts out these particular, it's called a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity. And so it's a direct response to the things that we're seeing happening in the Christian world. And you have a Jewish affirmation. It has like 7 key principles or something that is again representative of Jews rethinking Christianity, because now all of a sudden they're seeing a different face of Christianity that is not so hostile to Judaism and to the Jewish people. So yes, like that's a very important point, actually. Now, what I think is so remarkable in our own day is that you see it going both ways, right? Christians are rethinking their theology of Jews and Judaism. And as a result of that, Jews are then rethinking their perceptions and understanding and sort of categories for Christians and for Christian theology. So it's very remarkable in that way.
Yeah, maybe to try and, I don't know, let me just take a moment here because we're coming up to 30 minutes and we have a radio audience I want to say goodbye to. Thanks for joining us on Current FM. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to continue talking with Jen, and you can catch the rest of our conversation on the Goodview TV network, on our One New Man YouTube channel, and also on all of our different social media pages. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to have you back next week. God bless you. So what I guess I wanted to ask you, in light of all of the rapprochement, that's happening at certain levels. We have a popular level out there, and I'm not saying it's in the church necessarily, but I'm sure it's in some places. You've already kind of alluded to it. But we do have this rising tide of anti-Semitism. How should we, as the church, take what we know about the one people of God and the unity of Christ and stand up for Jewish people? And especially because the whole, and I'm certainly not anti, well, let me put it the other way around. I'm certainly a Zionist, which I think we both understand does not mean agreeing with everything that the government of Israel does. But there's a strong public connection to whatever the government of Israel does. And then you have the tropes about their dictating what our government does and who gets money for what and all these kinds of things. Where does the church come in all of this to try and stand for the truth of being the voice of reason?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously a very complicated question in our sort of post-October 7th environment, whereby it's actually shocking and deeply troubling to me that you have, I mean, I think anti-Semitism was already on the rise, but I think especially in the last 2 years, it's just very jarring to me. And I think, I think Christians, by virtue of this unique relationship that followers of Jesus have with the people of Jesus, the biological family of Jesus, which is the Jewish people, I think it is incumbent upon Christians to think deeply about these questions. And again, I'm with you. That does not mean that we uncritically sanction every single action of the modern state of Israel. But I'm also aware of what I would consider to be an extreme bias in most media sources on what is actually going on, for example, in Gaza. And if you just sort of dig a little bit deeper underneath these like sort of terrible headlines about Israel committing genocide and all of these things, I think there's a much more complex story going on. And it's very surprising to me that in sort of contemporary news and conversations about this war with Gaza, very little mention of Hamas. Like, that's shocking to me. And in this sort of, we had a spate of college protests, college campus protests, pro-Palestinian protests. Many of those students did not know what October 7th was. And so that's just shocking to me that there's this, I would say, again, kind of an ignorance, a bias that is not telling the whole story. And I think if we look at the actual tenets of Hamas, like, of course, Israel's bombing hospitals, because that's where Hamas members are hanging out. There was a recent incident a couple weeks ago about, and there was all this video footage about Israel bombed these very clearly aid workers who were working in a damaged hospital in Gaza. And so the media immediately jumps on it as like, look, Israel's killing innocent aid workers. And if you really dig deeper, those aid workers, many of them were Hamas members wearing orange vests.
Right.
And so I feel like the media almost assumes that Hamas is conducting a war on a level playing field, that Hamas has some sense of ethics and sense of what is right and wrong. And I think that's absolutely incorrect. Again, if we look at the very tenets of Hamas, they don't care about their own people. And I think Hamas's larger goal is to turn the entire world against Israel. And they're succeeding in large measure. And so again, I think it's very troubling. I'm with you in saying having Zionist theology, and there's lots of brands of Zionism in both Christianity and Judaism, does not mean that we think the state of Israel never gets anything wrong. It's a secular nation state like any other secular nation state. But it does mean, I think, thinking critically about these things and maybe seeing something and kind of wondering, is that the whole story? Is there a spin on this news source that I'm watching? Just sort of asking questions and maybe seeking out different perspectives. Like I said, that hospital that was hit in Gaza was this sensation on the news because it showed that Israel was indiscriminately killing civilians and aid workers, but that just simply was not the full story. So I think
that's been the case almost since the beginning, that you get these huge splashy headlines
Right.
And then 3 days later, oh, that wasn't right.
Yeah. And what's interesting,
There's a rush to publish
that's
without
right.
really investigating what has happened. The business with all the journalists that
Yeah.
were killed recently, well, that's a very loose definition of journalist that we're using here.
Yes.
Because basically anybody with a cell phone is a journalist these days if they want to be, right?
That's right. And it was shown that many of those journalists were Hamas members. So
Right.
it's very shifty. And what I was told recently that I think is fascinating is you have certain Christian leaders, particularly in Israel, that are issuing statements about these things that the media then picks up to say, see, even Christians think that Israel's a big bad empire. And what I was told, and again, I don't have like reliable source information for this, but the person that I was talking to, I think did, that those Christians have to be extremely careful about what they say on the record, lest they become a target of Hamas. So it's not even as though Christian leaders in Israel have freedom to really say what they think. So you have this interesting phenomenon whereby they're saying public statements that are very carefully worded. And then off the record, they're saying, Israel's doing the best that it can against an completely, inhumane enemy that's embedding itself in schools and hospitals in Gaza. So even when you hear, so-and-so made a public statement on behalf of Christians in Israel or whatever, I think even that is not going to be the whole story.
Yeah. Well, what would you, we were talking about, so how does the church step up in this time? You have plenty of pastors who don't want to be political, and I don't know if staying out of American politics is quite the same as staying out of the conversation about what's happening in Israel. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I understand some of the concerns that pastors face in terms of, they have diverse congregations, they have, maybe Arab members of their churches. I think it's a very delicate issue. And I would say, something other than speaking about these issues from the pulpit or whatever is simply making a commitment to pray for Israel, to pray for the Jewish people worldwide, to pray for this horrific conflict that continues, in Gaza, because sometimes our prayer life brings things to mind and gives us a perspective on things that simply having conversations about them might lead to sort of polarizing, problematic ways. But I think simply a commitment to pray, I think a commitment for Christians to pray about these things doesn't involve you to get political.
Right.
It's just, this is something I think that is a major issue in our world. And you can't be political by praying for it. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So,
right. All right. Well, we kind of departed from Nostra Aetate and the Nicene Council, but that's okay. So you want to tie those two things together?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this being the 60th anniversary of the publication of this document, Nostra Aetate. We talked about sort of the legacy that Nostra Aetate continues to have, as well as this Jewish response now to Christians rethinking, God's covenant with the people of Israel. And so this is also a significant year in that it's the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, which again has lots of different kind of things that we could talk about. I mean, the Council of Nicaea is sort of one of the, or perhaps the main moment in Christian history that bequeaths to us a very high Christology. You get this kind of Trinitarian formulation going on. You get the Nicene Creed, which is ultimately the product of the Council of Nicaea. And yet the Council of Nicaea is also the place at which the church officially decouples the celebration of Easter from the celebration of Passover. And it is right around the same time that you get the sort of declaration that the official day of Christian worship is on Sunday, which does have, I think, biblical roots in that Jesus is raised on Sunday, and so it's a natural time for his followers to gather. But it also becomes very political under Constantine in the 4th century, around the time of the Council of Nicaea, in that it's an intentional move to separate Christianity from Judaism. So I think the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed, there's sort of lots of things going on, both in terms of what I would say is a very important affirmation of what becomes sort of orthodox, correct Christian doctrine about the person of Christ, but also this kind of shadow side whereby the church is intentionally, very intentionally distancing itself from the Jewish people. And so, there's lots of buzz going on about this being the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea. There's been lots of conferences happening throughout the world on this. The Catholic Church actually issued a document earlier this year called Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. And one of the main authors of the document, it was issued by the International Theological Commission of the Catholic Church, is a Jewish Catholic bishop who has thought deeply about these things. And so I think the document itself, again, it's called Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, is very significant in that it's trying to, as much as we possibly can, think about a unity between Jews and Christians, again, sort of in the spirit of Nostra Aetate, as we look back on Nicaea. It's also raising the issue, this problematic, I would say, decision at the Council of Nicaea that gets made about decoupling Easter from Passover. And so I think you have, again, lots of people talking about the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea, but you have the Catholic Church really thinking in very intentional ways. Again, the Catholic Church, of course, being the same body that issued Nostra Aetate 60 years ago, about the problematic aspects of the Council of Nicaea and beginning to chart a way of rethinking those. And in the same way that Nostra Aetate does, kind of affirming that things like the Jewishness of Jesus, God's ongoing covenant with the Jewish people, as a way to frame Catholic theology all the way going back to Nicaea. It's also interesting. I just learned this recently that speaking of Easter, at Nicaea, you have the decoupling of Easter from Passover very intentionally as like a way to distance Christianity from Judaism. But also later on, you get a calendrical dispute that results in the Western Church celebrating Easter on a different day than the Eastern Church. So it's like, it's almost like this decoupling of Easter from Passover then kind of has this ripple effect of sort of segregating Easter in all these different ways. And what's fascinating is that it just so happens once in a while. So two things. Once in a while, it just so happens that Easter overlaps with Passover, right? And that I always feel like is very significant because biblically, theologically, there's a connection between those two events. Right. It also just so happens once in a while that the sort of Western reckoning of Easter aligns with the Eastern calendrical reckoning of Easter. And 2025 was one of those years that Eastern Christians and Western Christians celebrated Easter on the same day. So again, it's just this interesting, like, I'm not into like numerology or anything like that, but I just think it's interesting that 2025, sort of through the lens of theology and church history, is kind of an interesting year in all of these ways. And it's meaningful to me that the Catholic Church is reflecting very explicitly on not only the positive significance of the Council of Nicaea, but also these kind of more, again, as I said, sort of shadow side aspects of the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, there was a lot of ugly language about Jews leading up to Nicaea that brought a lot of that about, for sure. It's not a pretty picture even before Nicaea. There's a lot of anti-Jewish writing in the church fathers, and so Nicaea, that part of it was kind of a natural consequence of a lot of things leading up to it, for sure.
That's right.
Yeah, I always thought it's when I learned about it finally, whenever that was, but the idea that the Western Church and the Eastern Church are celebrating Easter on different days, but the Eastern Church has always coupled it with Passover. They stayed true to the Jewish reckoning for when this needed to be, and
yeah, I mean, in some ways, the Eastern Church does not have the same legacy, or at least not the same kind of legacy of anti-Judaism that the Catholic Church has, which is why I think it's so significant to see things like Nostra Aetate, to see things like this Catholic document, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, that are really like bringing those dark aspects of Catholic theology and Catholic history to the fore and trying to think creatively about them. I think it's very promising.
I think it is a show of not only good faith but repentance. And it kind of makes me, I asked you this in that email, but are we in a place where Catholics may become better friends to Jews than, well, certainly the progressive expression of the church in America, but even in evangelical circles, as they become more right-wing politically, that they also will kind of experience a creeping anti-Semitism, and Catholics are going to become the Jews' best friends?
I mean, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, because I think you also have, as I said, if we're talking about biblical scholarship, for example, like remarkable volumes of biblical scholarship from Protestant scholars as well, whether that's a widespread trend among Protestants, I think is an open question. And I think another thing to note is that, a difference between Catholicism and Protestantism is that Catholicism, has this magisterium, which is the official teaching office. And so there's like these sort of specific tenets of Catholic faith. And I would say that to some extent, that's where you're getting a lot of these documents, Nostra Aetate, the document this earlier this year. I still think there's a question of how much that has fully sort of trickled down. Right, exactly. And so it might be a little bit misleading to sort of say that all Catholics have this positive disposition towards Jews, because I'm not sure that that's the case. That's sort of increasingly becoming the case among the Catholic magisterium, the Catholic teaching office. But I don't know. I mean, it would be an interesting thing, because if we're talking about Protestantism, you also have all kinds of interesting things, like the history of Christian Zionism, for example, that has caused, in some what I would consider sometimes troubling ways, or theologically problematic ways, that has caused Christians to really sort of find a deep sort of spiritual affinity with the Jewish people, with the state of Israel. So it's an interesting question. It might be a little bit more complicated than that, or more complex than that. But I think nonetheless,
I'm a simple man.
Well, I don't know.
I want straight answers.
Reflecting.
No, I know. There's so much complexity in all these questions. There's no doubt about it. I guess our fallback position is always, in the end, all Israel will be saved, right?
That's right. That's right. That was Paul's fallback position. Like, I think it's a safe fallback position.
Yeah. My questions really all come back around to the whole business of reconciliation. Our leader, Lee Cantor, has actually established a relationship with a Catholic deacon, and he is a one new man. He sees that there are differences, but there is a greater unity in Yeshua that we need to promote.
Yeah.
We have a calling to witness to Jesus in the world, not to harp about our differences.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, one other thing that I had left over from our conversation prior from your book was the salvation history outline that looks like creation, fall, redemption, new creation, versus creation and consummation. And your take on the first one is there's this gaping hole that leaves out Israel entirely, and creation consummation is a better look at salvation history. And I've really been thinking about it, and it has a lot to commend it. Let me say that. So I'd like to hear you make the case for creation consummation, because it touches even on something I was reading today in Christianity Today about disabled people. And how God created, and this was what you brought out, I think, in your book, at least in germ form, that God created the world good, not perfect. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, again, I feel like there's sort of a lot of different directions that we could go with that. I think that so my thinking on this question has been quite influenced by the work of Kendall Solon, who's a Protestant Christian theologian who wrote his first book in the 90s, which was a published version of his dissertation, is called The God of Israel and Christian Theology, which I think is the best source that I know of that sort of diagnoses this problem of Christian supersessionism, which he kind of embeds within this common rendering. He calls it the canonical narrative, but you hear it referred to as lots of different things. And I sort of challenge my students to listen to sermons on Sundays and see how often you get even an implicit employment of this kind of 4-chapter narrative: creation, fall, redemption, new creation, and how that gets used. Because I don't think, it's sort of this reformed model, but I think it gets used in all kinds of circles as just sort of this organizing principle for understanding the biblical narrative. And Kendall Solon, in his first book, wants to say that the canonical narrative and the way that it's framed is kind of hopelessly flawed. Like, we need to find another way to tell the biblical story. And so he uses these categories of creation and consummation that sort of, in one sense, take the primary emphasis off the fall as the occasion for this kind of divine rescue mission that is embodied in the person of Christ. So I do think, and one of the things that I think Solon does is he takes, so you could say that this creation consummation narrative is primarily a Jewish narrative, right? It's a narrative that gets employed in Jewish tellings of sort of God's activity in the world, we could say. And then you could say that in the Christian telling of the story, you end up with kind of a sin salvation model, right? Like, the problem that drives the narrative forward is the problem of human sin, and God saves people from sin in the person of Jesus. So you have this creation consummation model that I think is much more a Jewish model, and you have this sin salvation model that is much more of a Christian model. If I'm intuiting correctly, maybe part of your hesitance with getting on board entirely with a creation consummation model is like, what about sin? What about atonement? What about all of these classic Christian touchstones? And so I think what Kendall Solon does is he basically wants to put this sort of sin salvation drama within a larger story of creation consummation, such that sin salvation does not become the only way that we understand the incarnation, the only way that we understand God's redemptive work in the world. What's interesting about all of that is that Kendall Solon recently wrote another book called Irrevocable, which is a collection of essays, and he's kind of going in different directions. But one of the things that he says in Irrevocable is he doesn't agree anymore with what he said 30 years ago, which was that the sort of standard canonical narrative, this creation, fall, redemption, new creation model, is hopelessly flawed. He doesn't think that anymore. He thinks it can be employed in ways that are non-supersessionist, in ways that don't end up kind of leaving Israel out of the story in very problematic ways. So I think that's interesting, right? Because he's one who came out of the gate very strong, just sort of critiquing the whole rendering of the biblical narrative. And now he's saying, actually, I don't think it's necessarily problematic. It just happens to have been construed in problematic ways.
Well, that was actually part of what I asked you. If you recall, I said, is there some way to write Israel into that?
Yeah, and there is. I mean, I think Solon in his new book only does that in kind of a sketch way. I'm still curious to see how he would propose that we write Israel in. And another place that I would like to at least comment on in this conversation, and this is going to be like our big theological words of the day. When you look, especially throughout the history of Christian theology, when you look at this story of creation, fall, redemption, new creation, you end up oftentimes getting a notion that, or you end up with a notion that Jesus came to solve the problem of human sin. And the big fancy theological term for that is infralapsarian Christology, meaning that the person of Christ, God's decision to become incarnate in the person of Christ, takes place as a result of the fall, as a solution to a problem. And I think there's all kinds of problems with seeing Christ as fundamentally, primarily, or exclusively a decision of God to solve a problem. So then the other position, and again, big theological word of the day, is supralapsarian Christology. So that God's eternal decree to become incarnate in the person of Christ took place before the fall. That was something that sort of shows God's commitment to covenant relationship with humanity, that of course climaxes in God becoming one with humanity in the person of Christ. And so I think that's another aspect of this conversation, that to the extent that spotlighting the fall as like the event that necessitates the coming of Christ leads us into, I think, a problematic way of construing the incarnation, whereby the incarnation is merely to solve a problem. And then you get into this question of like, well, then what happens once the problem is solved, right? Sort of in the end, when you have the restoration of all things. And there's actually one, I think maybe only one Christian theologian who has said that at the end of time, Christ disincarnates. And I think, many of us are like, wait, that's super weird. But it does make sense that you end up with a problem of like, why do we need the incarnation if the problem of human sin has already been solved? And I think there's a couple of very relevant books that are sort of dealing with these issues. And so I think it's another problem that often, I don't think it necessarily has to result from this canonical narrative, creation, fall, redemption, new creation, but it often does go in that way, whereby our understanding of the person of Christ and the incarnation is sort of collapsed into, that's just what God did to solve the problem of human sin. And I think that's sort of missing a big part of the story, if that's our only way to think about the person and the work of Christ.
Well, some of this is also coming out in the area of theories of atonement. They keep circling around. People raising the banner of penal substitutionary atonement, and others saying,
right.
well,
that's right.
That is one story. And so I have to say that the thing I like about creation consummation, and at least as I'm thinking about it, it does not require a lot of inquiry into why God became man so much. If I'm thinking about it this way, that God created all things good. He made people and it was very good, and he gave them dominion. And the expectation in giving them dominion is that they would work the ground, and this gets into the good, perfect thing, that they would work in God's creation to develop it, to bring it to its greatest glory. But having surrendered dominion to the serpent, this whole process that is in God's mind, I think that I'm a supralapsarian. Pardon me. That sets in motion God's rescue operation, if you will, but that's subsumed underneath this larger narrative of, I'm going to accomplish what I determined to accomplish, that this good thing I have given to humanity to work with is going to be brought in cooperation with me, but by humanity to its perfect consummation. And so Jesus is the perfect man, right? As well as being God incarnate. I'll butcher this terribly, and I think I'm pretty sure it's Chesterton, but it might have been Lewis. But this notion of Jesus being born in a cave, and how God dove like a diver deep, deep down into the deepest part of the ocean that you could possibly reach, and has dragged up all of creation with him. That's sort of where I am landing, I guess, in thinking about this. That this is what's happening in our world today. God was in Messiah reconciling all things to himself. This is what's happening now, right? That we are moving from God's good creation to God's perfect ending.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another sort of category to add to this conversation, and Mark Kinzer talks about this, and I talk about it a little bit in my book, Finding Messiah, is not just the notion of creation going from good to perfect, which is sort of what you're talking about. I think there's a lot of validity to that, but that that the arc is going from creation as being good to being holy. That's an interesting, I think, category to insert into this conversation, because if we look at holiness in the Old Testament narrative, I mean, the first thing to be declared holy in the book of Genesis is the Sabbath, actually. And so you have the notion that the Sabbath is sort of this little circumscribed day of holiness amidst a week of profanity is the word, but it doesn't quite translate, of just ordinariness, right? So that holiness, if we see the first mention of holy in the Bible is the Sabbath, there's something about this day, and there's a lot of Jewish writing about this. It's sort of a foretaste of eternity, right? And you see holiness throughout the Old Testament narrative. The Jewish people are sort of tasked with stewarding God's holiness. And this is one of the sort of logic or rationale between all of the sort of laws, right? They can't interact with things that are unholy. Priests can't go into cemeteries and be near dead bodies because they have to sort of preserve this sense of Israel's holiness. That's what the temple's all about, right? Is this sort of stewarding of God's holiness in the world. And so, but I think throughout the Old Testament narrative, you also get these kind of inklings, especially in the prophetic texts, of like one day. Zechariah writes about this towards the end of the book of Zechariah. One day, like the most ordinary things, the sort of bells on the horses, will be as holy as the instruments in the temple. So it's this sort of democratization of holiness that is the vision of where everything's headed, whereby holiness is not just this one specific thing that's carefully guarded by the people of Israel, but sort of covers the earth like the waters cover the sea. These notions of sort of universalizing God's holiness. And I think if we look at Jesus through that lens, we see all kinds of things kind of shifting. And I think we could talk about Gentile inclusion in this regard, right? All nations are welcomed into, are ushered into covenant with the God of Israel, are sort of sanctified through union with Christ, are made holy. But also, and there's really interesting scholarship on sort of Jesus and ritual purity issues. And ritual purity has a lot to do with preserving holiness. And so Jesus, for example, touches lepers, and rather than him contracting their state of sort of uncleanness, his holiness, his purity is now flowing outward. And so I think you can see the incarnation also in that way, right? As this sort of divine instrument of this expansion of holiness beyond the narrow confines that Israel was commanded to sort of preserve God's holiness. So I think that's another interesting aspect of the creation
that's really good for sure.
Conversation.
Yeah. Well, our time has gone by very quickly. I still have more questions than when I started.
That means it was a good conversation, right?
Yes, indeed. I'm just so grateful to have your time and your thoughtfulness and your wisdom and expertise. It's really a blessing to me and to all of our listeners. Thanks so much, Jen. When's the book coming out?
The goal is fall of 2026. So.
Okay, well, that's still a long way off, but it'll be here faster than you know.
I hope so.
Well, I hope we'll have a chance to talk again sometime well before fall of 2026. But I'm going to ask you now, if you would, to close us with prayer. We've touched on so much, and God is at work in the world, reconciling all things through Messiah.
That's right. Well, God, I just thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation, and I just pray your blessing over Jerry, over the listeners, that you would help us to wrestle with these issues and these questions in ways that ultimately help us to honor you and help us to know you more, God, especially when we talk about challenging topics like the modern state of Israel and anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. God, may you give each of us wisdom in our own contexts and circles of influence and the conversations that we may have about how to reflect you in the world and the truth of your commitment to your people, your commitment to redemption, your commitment to reconciliation. God, may we be agents of reconciliation, agents of truth telling in the circles in which we find ourselves, in the conversations in which we find ourselves. May you help us to have discernment in terms of how we can best make you known in the world. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thanks, Jen. God bless you. And we'll get together soon, I hope.
Sounds great. Thank you for the conversation.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.